What avoidants secretly expect during no contact and why it surprises you. Imagine discovering that the silence you think is pushing someone away may actually be creating questions they never expected to face. Imagine realizing that while you're sitting there wondering whether they care, whether they miss you, whether they've already moved on, there is an entirely different psychological process unfolding behind the scenes, one they rarely talk about and often don't even fully understand themselves. That's what makes no contact so confusing when an avoidant is involved. The outside story looks simple. They pulled away. They wanted space. They seemed fine. But the inside story is often much more complicated than most people realize. And today we're diving into the hidden expectations avoidants carry during no contact. Expectations that can completely change how you understand their behavior. If you've ever found yourself trying to decode the silence, wondering what is really happening beneath the surface, you're in the right place. And while you're here, do me a small favor. If these insights help you understand attachment, relationships, and human psychology on a deeper level, hit subscribe. Think of it as your way of making sure these conversations keep finding their way back to you whenever you need them most. One of the biggest misunderstandings about no contact is the belief that avoidants simply disappear emotionally the moment communication stops. People often assume that because avoidants value independence, distance, and personal space, no contact barely affects them at all. The narrative becomes painfully simple. They left, they got what they wanted, and now they're living happily without a second thought. But real human psychology rarely works that neatly. Avoidants spend much of their lives learning how to suppress emotional needs rather than eliminate them. That's a critical difference. Suppressing a feeling doesn't mean it disappears. It means it gets pushed beneath awareness where it becomes harder to recognize, harder to access, and often harder to understand. So when no contact begins, many people expect avoidants to experience immediate heartbreak the same way anxious individuals might. When that doesn't happen, they assume the avoidant never cared. But the truth is that avoidants often process separation differently. Their emotional reactions can be delayed, fragmented, and hidden even from themselves. What appears to be indifference on the surface may actually be emotional distancing mechanisms working exactly as they were designed to work. This is why so many people become shocked months later when an avoidant suddenly resurfaces, reflects on the relationship, or reaches out unexpectedly. The emotional story was happening all along. It just wasn't happening in a visible way. At the beginning of no contact, many avoidants experience something that feels surprisingly positive. Relief. Not because the relationship was meaningless, not because the other person didn't matter, but because the pressure, expectations, emotional intensity, and unresolved tensions suddenly disappear. For someone who often feels overwhelmed by emotional demands, silence can feel like finally coming up for air after being underwater. Their nervous system relaxes, their mind becomes quieter. The immediate challenges of maintaining emotional closeness are no longer demanding attention. This is the stage that confuses people the most because it can look like freedom, and in some ways it is. But relief is not the same thing as emotional closure. Relief is simply the absence of pressure. It doesn't automatically erase attachment, memories, affection, or unresolved feelings. In fact, this early sense of relief can create a false impression inside the avoidant's mind. They may believe they've moved on faster than they actually have. They may convince themselves that distance has solved everything. Yet underneath that relief, the emotional bond often remains intact, quietly waiting for time and absence to reveal what is still there. This is why the early phase of no contact rarely tells the full story. It captures the immediate reaction, not the eventual realization. And that realization becomes even more interesting, because many avoidants secretly carry an assumption they rarely acknowledge. They expect you'll eventually reach out. Not necessarily because they're arrogant, not necessarily because they're trying to manipulate anyone, but because many avoidants become accustomed to a certain relationship dynamic. They grow used to being the one who withdraws while the other person pursues. They become familiar with emotional distance being followed by reconnection. Over time, this pattern can create an unconscious expectation that the connection remains available regardless of how much space exists between you. Somewhere deep down, they believe the door is still open. They believe the relationship exists in a paused state rather than an ended one. Even if they never say it out loud, there can be an assumption that eventually a message will appear, a conversation will restart, or the familiar dynamic will resume. This expectation provides comfort because it allows them to enjoy distance without fully confronting loss. As long as they believe reconnection remains possible whenever they choose, they don't have to face the reality of permanent separation. This leads directly into another hidden mindset that many avoidants carry during no contact. They often operate as though nothing has fundamentally changed. While other people may experience separation as a dramatic ending, avoidants frequently place relationships into a kind of psychological storage. Instead of processing the relationship as over, they mentally set it aside. The connection becomes something suspended in time. This tendency serves an important purpose. If they fully acknowledge the relationship is gone, they may have to confront emotions they've spent years avoiding. Grief, regret, vulnerability, longing, uncertainty. Those feelings can feel overwhelming. So the mind chooses a safer alternative. It acts as though the relationship is simply inactive rather than finished. That's why months can pass with very little outward reaction. From the outside, it appears as though they've forgotten. But internally, the relationship may still occupy a protected space that remains untouched and unresolved. In many cases, they aren't actively letting go because they never fully accepted that letting go was necessary. But eventually, something unexpected begins to happen. Silence starts creating questions. The very thing they believed would provide peace begins generating uncertainty. When no message arrives, when no attempt at reconnection appears, when the familiar pattern fails to repeat itself, curiosity starts emerging where certainty once existed. Avoidants may not openly admit this. They may continue looking calm, collected, and unaffected. Yet beneath that exterior, questions begin forming. What are you doing now? Why haven't you reached out? Have you moved on? Are you happy without them? Did the relationship matter less than they thought? For someone who expected availability, genuine absence can become surprisingly unsettling. The silence no longer feels predictable. It no longer feels safe. Instead, it creates a space where assumptions start breaking down. And as those assumptions crumble, avoidants are often forced to confront a reality they never expected. The person they thought would always remain emotionally available may actually be gone. Not because of anger, not because of revenge, but because they finally chose themselves. And that realization marks the beginning of an entirely different emotional journey, one that many avoidants never see coming until it's already unfolding. And this is where one of the most surprising shifts begins to take place. For a long time, many avoidants unconsciously assume that if anyone is struggling with the separation, it must be the other person. Not because they are heartless, but because the relationship often developed around a familiar dynamic. One person moved toward connection while the other managed distance. One person voiced emotions while the other kept them contained. Over time, this can create a subtle belief that emotional investment exists more strongly on one side than the other. The avoidant may quietly assume that you are thinking about them more than they are thinking about you. They may believe that if enough time passes, your longing will eventually pull you back into contact. It is not always a conscious expectation. Often it operates beneath awareness. But this assumption gives them a sense of emotional security. It allows them to maintain distance without fully confronting the possibility of losing significance in your life. Then something unexpected happens. Days become weeks. Weeks become months. The anticipated message never arrives. The emotional gravity they expected to feel from your side remains absent, and for the first time they begin facing a possibility they never seriously considered before. What if you are no longer revolving around them at all? What if the person who once fought for connection is no longer waiting? That realization can be deeply destabilizing because it challenges a story they have quietly believed for a very long time. As that certainty begins to crack, another process often emerges beneath the surface. Their emotional radar turns on, not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself. In fact, it usually happens so subtly that even they may not recognize it at first. Suddenly, they become curious about things they previously ignored. They wonder what you're doing. They wonder who you're spending time with. They wonder whether your life looks different now. They may check social media more often than before. They may pay closer attention when mutual acquaintances mention your name. They may notice details they would have dismissed during the relationship itself. What's fascinating is that many avoidants do not seek this information because they are ready for vulnerability. They seek it because uncertainty has become uncomfortable. Human beings naturally want clarity, and avoidants are no exception. The difference is that instead of directly asking questions, they often search for answers from a distance. They want reassurance without exposure. They want information without emotional risk. They want to know they still matter without having to admit that they care whether they matter. This creates an internal contradiction. The more they try to appear unaffected, the more curious they become. The more curious they become, the harder it is to maintain the belief that nothing has changed. Every unanswered question quietly chips away at the emotional walls they have worked so hard to maintain. What surprises many avoidants even more is what happens when they discover that you are genuinely building a life without them, not performing independence, not pretending to move forward, actually moving forward. There is something profoundly powerful about a person who stops chasing validation and starts investing in themselves. When avoidants see signs of real growth, it often triggers emotions they never anticipated. Maybe they notice you pursuing goals that were once delayed. Maybe they see you developing confidence that no longer depends on external approval. Maybe they recognize a version of you that seems calmer, stronger, and more emotionally grounded than before. Suddenly the absence feels different. Before, your silence was interpreted as temporary. Now it begins looking permanent. Before, your growth seemed impossible without the relationship. Now your growth appears to be happening because of the distance. This can create a strange mixture of admiration and discomfort. On one hand, avoidants are often deeply attracted to independence. They respect strength. They admire self-sufficiency. On the other hand, your independence removes the safety net they unconsciously relied upon. If you truly no longer need them, then their position in your life is no longer guaranteed. The dynamic shifts. The emotional balance changes. And what once felt secure begins feeling uncertain. Beneath all of this lies a fear that many avoidants rarely discuss, even with themselves. The fear of being forgotten. People often assume avoidants fear intimacy more than anything else, but there is another fear hidden beneath that surface. The fear that one day they will look back and realize they were not as unforgettable as they imagined. During a relationship, emotional distance can create an illusion of control. If someone continues reaching out, continues caring, continues making space for you, it becomes easy to assume that connection will always exist in some form. No contact threatens that assumption. Every passing day becomes evidence that life continues without them. Every new experience you have without their involvement quietly reinforces the reality that the world does not stop turning when they leave. For someone who values autonomy, this realization can be surprisingly painful. Not because they want constant attention, not because they crave dependency, but because every human being wants to feel significant. Every human being wants to believe they mattered. And when no contact continues far longer than expected, avoidance may begin confronting an uncomfortable question. If this person can truly move forward without me, what does that mean about my place in their story? This fear often remains hidden because acknowledging it requires vulnerability. It requires admitting that loss affects them too. Then comes one of the most important turning points in the entire no-contact journey. Relief slowly begins transforming into loss. This shift rarely happens overnight. It often unfolds so gradually that avoidants fail to recognize it while it is happening. At first, the absence felt peaceful. Then it felt normal. Then it became familiar. But eventually, familiarity creates space for reflection. Without constant distractions, memories begin surfacing differently. The relationship is no longer viewed through the lens of recent conflict, pressure, or emotional overwhelm. Time softens certain experiences. Distance changes perspective. Suddenly they remember moments they overlooked, conversations they dismissed, acts of care they took for granted. They start noticing the shape of the absence itself. Not just your absence, but the absence of what you brought into their life. The comfort, the consistency, the understanding. The emotional presence they once believed would always be available. This is where many avoidants experience emotional lag. Their feelings arrive after the circumstances have changed. By the time they fully understand what they lost, the other person may already be healing. By the time they begin missing the connection may no longer be waiting. And that is why no contact can become such a powerful mirror. It removes distractions. It removes assumptions. It removes the illusion of guaranteed access. Eventually, it forces avoidants to sit with something they spent years avoiding. The reality that space does not erase attachment, and sometimes the silence they thought they wanted becomes the very thing that reveals what they were afraid to lose. And once that realization begins settling into place, something interesting starts happening behind the scenes. The relationship that once felt easier to ignore suddenly becomes harder to escape mentally. This is the stage where many avoidants begin replaying the relationship in private, not necessarily in the emotional way most people imagine. They are often not sitting in dramatic sadness or openly grieving every memory. Instead, they revisit moments through analysis. They examine conversations they once dismissed. They reconsider conflicts they thought were entirely justified. They start connecting dots that never seemed important when the relationship was active. During the relationship itself, emotional closeness can feel overwhelming to an avoidant nervous system. But distance changes the equation. Distance removes immediate pressure. It removes expectations. It removes the feeling of being emotionally cornered. And when that pressure disappears, memories often become easier to access. Suddenly, moments that seemed insignificant gain emotional weight. A supportive conversation, a shared laugh, a quiet gesture of care, a time when someone chose understanding instead of judgment. These memories begin surfacing unexpectedly because the avoidant mind is no longer focused on protecting itself from closeness. Instead, it is left alone with perspective, and perspective can be surprisingly powerful. The longer the silence continues, the harder it becomes to maintain a one-dimensional narrative about what the relationship was. Complexity enters the picture, regret enters the picture, appreciation enters the picture. They begin seeing not only what was difficult, but also what was valuable. As this process unfolds, another hidden expectation often comes into focus. Many avoidants secretly expect that emotional access to former partners will remain available indefinitely. They may not consciously think about it this way, but the assumption exists. Somewhere in the background is a belief that if they ever truly wanted to reconnect, the opportunity would still be there. This expectation provides psychological comfort because it allows them to delay difficult emotional decisions. Why process loss today if the connection can theoretically be revisited tomorrow? Why confront regret now if another chance remains possible in the future? But no contact challenges this assumption in a way that few other experiences can. Every day of genuine silence sends the same message. Access is no longer guaranteed. The person who once made themselves emotionally available is no longer standing in the same place. They are no longer waiting for breadcrumbs. They are no longer maintaining the connection on behalf of both people. And for avoidants, this realization can feel deeply unsettling because it removes a safety net they never fully appreciated. What they often miss isn't just the person, it's the certainty. The certainty that someone cared. The certainty that someone would answer. The certainty that someone remained emotionally invested regardless of distance. Once that certainty disappears, they are forced to face something unfamiliar, consequences that cannot be postponed indefinitely. Then comes the moment that changes everything. The moment they begin realizing you are not simply surviving without them, you are actually moving forward. There is a profound difference between waiting while pretending to heal and genuinely